Well, thank you for coming to the workshop this afternoon. This large audience, it's hard to compete with those beautiful beaches out there. This workshop is on relational wisdom for estate planning families. And I know you all are attorneys, but I'm going to be speaking as though I'm talking to a family that is considering estate planning or dealing with issues that have already come up in estate planning. In the next workshop, I'll be doing one specifically to attorneys with more of a focus on some of the legal dynamics. This one's going to focus a lot on relational dynamics. And I want to start just by a story. When I first started practicing law, I was working with another senior attorney. The first major case we worked on was a probate. And we got involved with this family. And after just a few hours of working with them, I was just totally puzzled. They were spending thousands of dollars in attorneys' time fighting over material possessions that had essentially no material value. If you took them and sold them at a garage sale, people would pay like $3. And I talked to this older attorney, more experienced attorney, and I said, why would people do this? And he said, Ken, in many cases, these material possessions become a substitute for the time and attention and affection that they didn't feel they had from a parent. Or they become a substitute because they feel they were somehow cut short of other privileges or resources during their parents' lifetime, and now they're trying to make up for it. And it's not a conscious thing, it's a subconscious thing that is irrational when you look at it from the outside, but to them they are driven by it. And what I want to talk about today are what are the things that people can do, families can do, preferably long before they pass away, even long before they start the estate planning process in earnest. What are the relational dynamics they can build into their family that can prevent these things? And I want to start off with the fact that these estate planning issues, problems with inheritance, are not new issues. 2,000 years ago, Jesus had to deal with an estate issue. As it says in Luke 12, 13 through 15, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, to the audience, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Now, Jesus was well aware of the technical rules and laws of his day on dividing an inheritance. They were spelled out pretty specifically. But instead of pointing to those things, he went right to what he knew was the heart of the answer, which is the heart, the human heart. What was driving this brother looking for a greater share of the inheritance? Jesus knew that our hearts are often ruled by covetousness, greed, false ideas of value and security, revenge, unforgiveness. All these things can come to play in inheritance situations. Now, the legal and financial side of estate planning, even though it can be pretty complicated, and you want to make sure you've got a very well-qualified attorney to deal with those issues, I've usually found those are not the things that usually trip up this process. It's the human side, the relationships that complicate things. Conflicted or dysfunctional relationships, broken relationships, are often what makes this job a lot harder for families and for attorneys. Compounding this is the fact that spouses, advisors, business partners, heirs often disagree on what's best. And as soon as you start getting into a situation, you can have all sorts of complications. I dealt with one family, and I was dealing with 7 siblings in a conflict over the family estate. And it very quickly became evident that whenever one sister asked for an assistant in the side room, it automatically disagreed. It didn't matter what it was. And they both had sort of formed little factions of the brothers and sisters. So these two groups, led by these two sisters, who were both in their 60s or 70s, were just perpetuating this long conflict. And I finally sat down with both of them in a separate room and just began to ask questions. What is driving this thing? And they were making it look like it was a disagreement over assets. Well, what had really happened was 20 years earlier, there had been a conflict between these two sisters that had never been resolved. And so every time there was a situation came up, they looked at it as an opportunity to confront and oppose the other person. So that comes up very strongly. Now, the best way to prevent these problems is to try to build loving, honest, authentic, healthy relationships in the family throughout the years, even from when they're very young, is building these relational dynamics into your family. That's when the process should begin. And then the entire family could be up to speed on these relational issues. And so even if it's not mom and dad having the conversation, siblings can get together, their families can get together. They can talk about the vacation condo down on the beach in Florida. They can talk about different issues that come up and that they can anticipate might be an issue and actually facilitate these issues on how their parents deal with it. If we don't develop these skills, then we're going to be facing the emotional turmoil, pride, greed, envy, and all those relational things that come up. Now, if a conflict does arise in a family, then you have to move into a peacemaking mode. And what I found is if you try to keep moving ahead with the probate or executing the estate plan or the trust, while there's all these unresolved relational issues, they'll just keep and be sand in the gears. And there's times you have to put the technical process aside, put that on pause, and start dealing with the relational dynamics. And that's what I'm going to talk about quite a bit today, is also the peacemaking dynamic. Let's talk about some of the basic challenges that arise in many of these situations more specifically. In simplest terms, what I would say drives most complications in estate planning and probate is three things. A lack of God awareness. We forget who God is, what He's like, what His ways are, what He says about our assets and our property. We forget, or we fall into a lack of self-awareness. We don't even realize what's driving us. Sometimes parents have been disappointed and one child wasn't more attentive or more appreciative, and in the estate planning process, without even realizing it, they're going to sort of get back at that child. If you don't know what's driving your own heart, there's things that are going to come out against other people. I call that the hidden puppeteer of hidden emotions and interests driving people inside, and they're doing things that they don't realize exactly why they're doing it. And the third area of weakness is other awareness. Being insensitive or unaware of how your words or actions are going to come across to someone else. And it never ceases to amaze me in mediations where one person is saying something, making a position or just communicating a perspective in a way that to them seems completely reasonable. And I can see as I look at the other party how it is just really offending them and they're about to explode. And the speaker doesn't even have any appreciation on how this approach to communicating is offending the other person. So we're going to talk about ways to develop those three things: God awareness, self-awareness, and other awareness. Another failure to be very sensitive to is the failure to realize that perceptions of reality are often more controlling than true or actual reality. In simple sense, if a wife feels her husband doesn't love her, he might truly love her, but if her perception is that he doesn't care about her, that he values his job and his hobbies and his toys more than her, that perception is going to have a huge effect on how she interacts with her husband. Same thing goes on in estate planning. If one child has a perception that the parents have always favored the other children, even if you could get out a piece of paper and have an accountant go through and itemize all the gifts and transactions in advance and they all came out even, that perception that another one was favored will be very controlled. My kids are 27 and 25, and to this day, they both tell us, sort of laughing, but sort of serious, you're a lot softer on my brother than you are on me. You're a lot easier on my sister than you are on me. It's just part of human nature. We tend to look at it that way. But those perceptions, even if they're very inaccurate, can be very controlling. A third issue is to not realize that expressed objections or demands, people are focusing in on who gets some assets, some stock, a vacation home, some personal property, a car in the garage. Those expressions of wanting those things, those demands, are often driven by unexpressed desires and concerns inside people, fears, desires, and agendas. Sometimes they're consciously aware of it, and in many cases they don't even realize it themselves until someone helps them think it through and pray about it. And this is something that comes up in most mediation cases I do. It takes someone else to sit down and say, what is really going on here? And it's only when people slow down, sort of pull down their own mask, they start to face that. Some practical issues that come up is when there's Christian parents, say 3 of their 4 children are believers, 1 child is not. And that 1 child, or you can reverse it, 1 Christian child, 3 who aren't. And the non-Christians are really, really unhappy about a huge part of the estate going to kingdom work. And they can make an issue. They can contest that whole process. You can have advisors or business partners who are playing a role in the estate planning. You've got some self-interested agendas. They won't come right out and say that, but if you really got down honest, there's some things going on there that aren't always in the best interest of the testators. One or other more children or grandchildren could have substance abuse issues. I've seen this in a lot of cases, or other destructive lifestyles. And even though the parents want to pass on some resources to them, they're really concerned this is just going to go to buying drugs or something. And so how do you actually hold back on those issues and help the child rather than just giving them enough to actually perhaps in some cases kill them? You can also have situations where there's grandparents who don't view adopted grandchildren as on an equal standing as their natural grandchildren. Now that's amazing to me. I've got 2 adopted children. They are my children. They are my children. I love them deeply. But there's some cases where grandparents will have a different view of that. And you talk about driving a wedge into that family if you treat those children differently. An even more distressing one to me is where a father who's divorced his first wife and now has a second or third wife down the road is going to disinherit children. And it breaks people's hearts. There's actually been some pretty famous big national lawsuits, fights over those things where you have that kind of conflict. Another case I've been involved in quite frequently is where one child has dedicated his or her life to running a family business, ranch, or farm. I'm from Montana. There's a lot of situations where one son has stayed on the farm for many, many years, helping dad run it. There's been sometimes an unspoken, sadly, commitment that when dad dies, the son will get the farm, but there's other siblings living all over the United States that only come home for vacations, haven't done anything to make that a going concern, and yet when the parents die, they expect a full equal share in it. And in many cases, what that's going to mean to divide it up like that is actually selling off the property. There just simply aren't enough resources to give the assets to offset that. So there's some significant things go up there. And a similar case is where one child has given a substantial amount of time to caring for an elderly parent. I had one case where a niece actually left her job in California, came to Montana, and for 10 years was the primary caregiver to her aunt and uncle. And there was an understanding, but sadly they had not incorporated this into a will, that they would leave a house to her in appreciation because she had stepped away from her career that long. And yet they hadn't properly documented it. It just created a tremendous amount of pain in that family. Another issue that comes up is not really helping people understand the significance of powers of attorney and what all those conditions mean and what the parents' expectations were. Maybe having co-powers for health care, and now dad is in the hospital, there's a question about what kind of care to give to him, and brother and sister can't agree, and that just can create no end of complexity and stress on the family and even for the healthcare providers. And the final one I've run into is where we sort of automatically give the power of attorney or other running a company to the oldest sibling, when in fact the oldest sibling may not be the most qualified person to run that business or execute those responsibilities. So all of those are things that are just easy to fall into. So what are some things that can be done to anticipate those issues? One of those things I would always encourage families to do is make sure you're working with an attorney and other professionals who are sensitive to these spiritual and relational issues. They're not just technocrats. They're people who understand that the real issue in these situations is people. And some folks don't realize that this is actually a professional responsibility of attorneys, is to address the spiritual, relational, personal issues going on with their clients. In fact, the American Bar Association's Professional Rule of Conduct 2.1 says, in representing a client, a lawyer shall exercise independent professional judgment and render candid advice. In rendering advice, a lawyer may refer not only to law, but to other considerations such as moral, economic, social, and political factors that may be relevant to a client's situation. It doesn't specifically mention spiritual there, but it's implicit that there's other issues, and in many cases, more significant and more controlling issue than the legal issues themselves. So always make sure you're working with an attorney who is sensitive to those issues, who knows when to put a pause on the technical process and deal with the relational aspect. Another thing I strongly recommend to Christians is to make sure they build a conciliation clause into their wills and trusts. And these clauses are uniformly enforceable in contracts today, where you put a clause in saying if we have some kind of dispute down the road that can't be resolved personally, we agree to take it into mediation. That doesn't work into legally binding arbitration. Now, those are 100% enforceable in legal contracts. In the case of trusts and wills, states vary. Some states will not enforce those because they would say that the beneficiaries or the heirs were not a party to the contract and didn't commit to it. So that's going to take place in some states. But there's other states, for example, like Texas, where the court has said, no, if you receive the benefits from something, you'll assume to be consenting to the terms of that instrument. But even if you're in a state where it's not legally enforceable, I still encourage people to put these clauses in their trusts and their wills, because there's at least moral suasion. When the siblings sit down after mom and dad have passed away and having this tension, they can at least say, listen, mom and dad made it really clear that their highest priority was not how the money was divided, but that our family would emerge in this thing united and still a close family. If that was their last and most compelling desire, let's respect them on that. So that might be just enough moral suasion. Yes?
You've heard of ethical wills, you've heard of that concept where, I don't call it precatory language, but there's language throughout the will of like, you know, you were a 6-year-old little girl, you like this, so I want you to have this. And, you know, parents talk about their value system. I would think that would support, if you put your Christian values throughout the document, your trust and will, that would be supported. The only thing I'm worried about is that somehow that precatory language might get into distribution or get into those issues, and now you're going to be getting into this pull, or it gives an opportunity for litigation to.
It does. Yeah, that's where having a good attorney involved to know when it's appropriate to put things in. Sometimes you can have a separate letter, where you can have some separate documents that are written to indicate the testator's wishes and preferences. Those things could be helpful too. You run into all sorts of issues when you add that kind of language to a trust or a will, but I think it is important for parents to do all they can to communicate, preferably while they're living, but even in some things that will survive them, whether it's a letter or a video, whatever, what their deeper issues are, their deeper concerns.
Well, it's kind of amazing because my experience has been the young guys in 20s and 30s, 15 pages of value system I'm going to pass on. 50s and 60s, 10 pages. I had a guy 84 years old, trust Jesus, I don't know what else to tell you. And but that was enough, I would think, to be enough to say, you know, he means to follow this conciliation clause.
Yeah, I would include it. It won't hurt you, and it can certainly help you. I've had cases where that was the deciding factor, even in a jurisdiction where they weren't legally enforceable. At least the siblings recognized that was their parents' preferences.
Ken?
Yes.
I have a question, technical question.
Yeah.
I've used your model language for years in my wills and trusts. The current version that we have, I think, is identical to what you illustrate in your outline, except it does not say a divisional relational wisdom 360. It says, I think it says a divisional peacemakers.
Yeah.
So what do I do with that, with all these documents that have been signed with the reference to peacemakers?
The current ones, Peacemaker Ministries passed the Institute for Christian Conciliation, the Conciliation Division, off to a couple of people who have an LLC in Southern California. And they are the owners now of the Institute for Christian Conciliation Service brand. So your current clauses would use their rules and their process, unless the parties agreed to go elsewhere. And the original rules, where they were written, said that parties are free to choose their own conciliators and administrators. They're not locked into Peacemaker or the ICC. There's a default clause that says if they can't agree, then it automatically is administered by the ICC. So our clause is very similar. It simply says that if there's by default, if people can't agree and they have one of our clauses, then we would be the ones who would assign the conciliators. So they both would send to essentially identical rules. The difference with us is our conciliators are cross-trained in relational wisdom, sort of a deeper level of relational skills. We can talk more about that afterward. There's other dynamics going on there. Okay. Okay, let's move into There's actually a link in your study guide also. If you want to learn more about this Christian conciliation concept and what services are, there's a link there to our website, talks about conciliation and how it can serve you. Let's talk about some of the relational skills that you can apply before, upstream of conflict, or during conflict. And I want to just introduce this idea of emotional intelligence, first of all. Emotional intelligence has been around since 1920-25. It's the idea that we have, just as we have an IQ, intelligent quotients on learning and applying information in our lives, we have an emotional quotient or emotional intelligence on how we read our emotions and manage them, and how we read the emotions of others and interact with them based on that information. We all have this capacity to a certain degree, but like playing the piano, literally, it's something you can develop and get better and better at. So this is a very popular concept in the world today. There's some excellent training out there on emotional intelligence. I'm actually a certified EI instructor. I found this training to be very helpful. The trouble is, classic secular emotional intelligence leaves out a pretty big component, which is who made relationships. There's no doctrine of God, doctrine of creation, doctrine of man, doctrine of sin, doctrine of redemption, doctrine of sanctification, the gospel. I mean, these are big factors for a Christian. So even though we encourage people to be up to speed on the neurological aspects of emotional intelligence, we have developed a biblically grounded form of emotional intelligence. We call it going beyond emotional intelligence. And this paradigm, the way we organize the teaching in the Bible and all the information we now know about how God designed the brain, has two primary dynamics we're looking at. Number one, relationships are inherently three-dimensional. God designed us to be in relationship with Him, with ourselves, and with the people around us. We are to operate in three dimensions simultaneously. And whenever I've been managing a conflict with a family in conflict, typically they have forgotten that top part,
right.
God. And it is only me and you. You know, I deserve this, and you did this, and I got this, and you shouldn't do this. They're operating at a totally horizontal level. And bringing that God dimension back into it is always the most crucial step in an effective mediation. In each of those three dimensions, there's two dynamics we need to be thinking about. One is what we call an awareness dynamic. What do I know about God? Who He is, what He's like, what He teaches, what is His track record, what are His promises? Secondly, what do I know about myself? What are my strengths, my weaknesses? What's really driving me right now? We often deceive ourselves what our real motives are. What do I know about other people? Why is my sister acting like this? Why is she not speaking to me? Why is she clinging so hard to this statue in Dad's den? What's going on here? So awareness is key, and we have to think about it. We have to use the good senses God gave us. Our eyes, our ears, watching people, listening to their voice, seeing the look in their face, reading that body language. Lots of information coming to us. Most people, in my experience, have not developed very highly all these other ways of processing information. We just hear what someone says and say, hey, he doesn't want this. And we miss the real deeper issue going on. But awareness itself is not enough. We have to have an engagement, an action component. What am I going to say? What am I going to do? So in regard to God, there's a lot in the Bible that talks about how we engage or respond to God. Trust, obedience, faithfulness, worship are all commandments, imperatives in God's Word. How am I going to engage or manage myself? Self-control, self-discipline, putting off, putting on, growing in grace, seeking after God. Many imperatives for action about ourselves. And then finally, what am I going to do as I interact with this other person? How do I encourage my brother? How do I listen to my brother? How do I bless my brother? How do I become an instrument of healing in my brother's life when he has these unresolved issues with our father who's now passed away? Can I be actually an instrument of healing there? So being aware of the role you can play in all those issues. So that's our basic paradigm. 6 basic skills: God awareness, God engagement; self-awareness, self-engagement; other awareness, other engagement. And you'll notice that the bottom 2/3 is your classic emotional intelligence. We bring in that top part, which is God. Now, you don't see phrases like God aware or self-engaging in the Bible, but there's many, many synonyms for these skills. Remember the Lord your God. Faithfulness, consistent obedience. Humility, being able to honestly look at ourselves. Self-discipline, compassion, service. Those are all biblical synonyms, and those synonyms capture literally thousands of verses that communicate all these concepts to us. So that's the basic paradigm we're looking at to apply whenever we're dealing with trying to develop relational skills in advance, and then also how do we apply those things if there is actually a conflict. One of the ways that we want to encourage people to develop these skills, and again, before a crisis arises, it's a lot better to do it upstream, we use acrostics. So the simplest acrostic we use, which applies to that entire paradigm, is something we call the SOG plan. In every situation, seek to be self-aware, other-aware, God-aware. That simple three-letter acrostic summarizes the whole paradigm. And when I'm mediating with people, whether it's a formal mediation or doing something with one of my children and someone in his or her life, I'm always trying to think, okay, what's going on inside of you? How are you affecting the other person? How can you minister to the other person? Where is God in this thing? Let me give you a simple example. And I use this example just to encourage you that if you're practicing this in your own personal life day to day, then as you have later on complications in an estate planning process, for example, it's not something you're suddenly taking out of a dust-covered closet and suddenly trying to practice it, but it's something you're doing every day, to the point that it's just part of your automatic way of engaging people. And here's the illustration. For 28 years of my marriage, my wife Corlette and I had very different depth perceptions. When we're driving and I get ready to make a left-hand turn, I see a car coming the other lane and I see it's quite a ways away, it's driving the speed limit, there's plenty of time to make a turn, no problem. When I turn that turn signal on and my wife realizes I'm going to turn left, she sees the car, her brain says it's only half as far away and it's moving twice as fast as I think it is. Her brain just sees that, processes it differently. Now there's something neurologically going on. There's two little lobes in your brain that are actually getting data and then processing data. What is going on and how much of a risk is it? And sometimes they're just adjusted differently. It's a neurological difference. And even though I could factually, if I had freeze time, I could measure the car, measure the speed and convince her, that doesn't convince her at all that it really is safe. And so for years, 28 years, I go to make a left-hand turn on the turn signal, Corlette would gasp, and she'd grab the door handle and I'd start pumping the brake on the other side of the car. And frankly, it would irritate me. And I think, after 28 years, we've never been in an accident, I spent a lot of time protecting you from harm, and still you don't believe me. Now, I didn't say that, but I felt it. And that irritation would come across in how I engage her. So sometimes I just go, ugh. I'd let out some little gasp of my own. Sometimes, I go ahead and make the turn, and I would look in the rearview mirror, and I go 1001, 1002, 1003. Real loving, real loving. It didn't do anything to help our relationship. And the fact, it was doing a lot of harm to our relationship. It was insensitive. So one day, after I've been getting into relational wisdom more and more recently, I went to make a left-hand turn, hit the turn signal, she gasped, grabbed the door handle, and it's just like time stopped for me for just a moment. I started thinking, okay, what's going on here? Self-aware. What is it that's driving me to make this turn? I mean, are 6 seconds of time going to make all the difference getting to the store? And what's really going on is it's pride. I know I'm right. I've got the facts. It's my way. It was just pure selfishness, pure pride and selfishness going on in me. There was no necessity to make that turn. Otherwise, I thought about my wife. I thought she is genuinely apprehensive. And I was learning a lot more about what fear and anxiety does. There was cortisone and adrenaline pumping into her system. It is corrosive. It actually makes us age more rapidly. It affects our heart. So I was putting stress into her life. I was actually doing little stressful things to our relationship. She was viewing me as being insensitive and uncaring. It wasn't doing anything good for our relationship. And then I thought of God. Where's God in this? And the first thing that came to my mind was Ephesians. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. I just don't see Jesus doing deliberate things that he knows unnecessarily stresses. Now, he allows suffering, he allows tests, but it's deliberate, it's loving, he knows what he's doing. It's not just, I'm going to do it my way. And I just became deeply convicted. And that whole process, which took me a couple minutes to describe, happened in just moments. And so instead of completing the turn, I just waited. And I waited. And I waited. And by the time the car finally passed, I made the turn, it was very evident to Corlett that there had been plenty of time. But I didn't say that, I just made the turn and started down the other street, and she reached over and touched my arm and said, "Thank you so much." I realized for 28 years, I could have been sending a signal, "I love you, I care about you. Your stress level is very important. I want to keep it as low as possible because you mean more to me than 6 seconds of time." And so every time now that I wait on a left-hand turn, or I don't come up quite as close to someone driving in front of me, or all the other things closely related, it's a way of me saying, "I love you, I care about you." So my question for you is, what's your left-hand turn? What if you just really stop to think on how you engage your spouse or coworkers or whatever? Just a simple one for a lot of people is, in many couples, one of them is often running late getting to an engagement, and it irritates the other one. It creates tension in their relationship. Could you start 5 minutes earlier getting ready? If you're practicing this SOG plan day to day with your family, with people as you drive, as coworkers, it just becomes part of the way you are, and it'll play itself out as you're dealing with estate planning. In the study guide you've got, there's definitions for these terms, God awareness and God engagement, self-awareness. You can look at those. They're pretty self-explanatory. But I want to talk about 2 other acrostics here real quickly. One of these is the one we use to develop a better capacity for being self-aware and self-engaging. How do I read myself and manage myself more effectively? And it's called the READ acrostic. And it stands for 4 things, which is to recognize an emotion, to name it, to evaluate its source, to anticipate the consequences of following the emotion, and then to direct that emotion in a constructive direction. And the power of this acrostic is it recognizes the fact that emotions drive us in life. In fact, most of the decisions we make in life are driven to some degree, if not entirely, by emotions. Now, we may think that we're acting in a rational way, but in fact, we often are acting just in an emotional way. For example, being from Montana, not an unusual scenario for a man to be driving home from work. He drives by a car lot, sees a beautiful brand new black Chevy pickup truck. He goes, "Oh man, that is a beautiful truck." And he wants that truck. He desires that truck. And all the way home, he's thinking, how's he going to rationalize this to his wife? Well, we could have some great vacations with the kids in the mountains, and I could go up there and cut firewood, and we could save money. And all of that is just rationalizing a desire that is driving him. And so to recognize what is really going on here, what is that desire? Now, the importance of recognizing and naming an emotion is just cannot be overstated, and here's why. There's a study being done one time. We got about 50 people, interviewed them extensively about one of the most significant emotional events in their lives. When they graduated from college, top of their class, when they got married, first child, job promotion, won a big case, whatever it might be. What are some of the sad things in life? Losing a child, getting fired, whatever those painful things are. And they put each of these groups into a functional MRI machine to measure brain activity. It measures blood flow, and that's how you know which part of the brain is most active, is by how much blood is flowing. With the first group of people, they said, we're going to trigger some of these memories through a set of headphones. We're going to mention some of these things you shared with us. And as we mention it, we want you just to passively experience the emotion. Don't process it, don't analyze it, just experience it. And so they would trigger an emotion, and on the scope where they're measuring blood flow, they would see the amygdala and the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, which is right on top of the spinal cord, the first place where sensations come in. And they would see that part of the brain really light up. And depending on the intensity of the emotion, like losing a child, a 1-year-old child in an accident, extremely painful memory, man, that part of the amygdala is just really active. And then after a while, it would dissipate. Then they would trigger another emotion, limbic system would light up again, and that would dissipate. The second group of people, they had them do the same thing with one change. They said, as soon as we trigger that emotion, that memory, name the emotion. Joy, delight, fear, anxiety. Just mentally, not even verbally, just mentally put a name to that emotion. And here's what was different. When they triggered the emotion, the limbic system would light up, the emotional part of the brain would be very active right away, and then you'd see the neocortex lighting up, the reasoning part of the brain lighting up. And the reason is your language skills are located in your neocortex. In order to attach a name to an emotion, it's like you have to open a door into another room and get that information and process it. That's how God designed our brain to work. Not in just pure emotion driving us forward, but bringing in the reasoning capacity so that both the emotion, which is designed to move us to action, and the reasoning capacity, which is also where we not only have our language skills, it's the sermons we've heard, the spiritual principles, the lessons we've learned, the impulse control, all of that is going to be in the neocortex. You bring those things together, your brain is working the way God wants it to. So, relating that to an estate planning process, if you're sitting there talking to a couple, and a husband and wife are in strong disagreement on how they're going to include certain children or give things to certain ministries, and there's an intense disagreement, if you can get to the bottom of what's driving that, and even help them to process their emotions, there may be something that happened, some disappointment, some offense, a child didn't do something that the father wanted, or maybe the mother feels that there's been too much favoritism. And if those things are driving, those emotions are driving them forward and they can't put their finger on it, then really evaluate, why do I feel this resentment toward my second child? Why do I feel so strong about favoring my daughter? What's going on here? But when you start to name these emotions, you start helping them evaluate it, and then especially anticipating, okay, what happens if we cut this child out of the will? What happens if we reduce this child's share of the estate? What is really going to happen in the long run? This emotion of sort of getting back or equalizing things today, what's the long-term price that our family is going to pay for that? And then say, okay, what can we do with this emotion? How can we direct that emotion more constructively? In some cases, it may mean, you all need to get your pastor to sit down with his son. You need to talk through this event. Maybe there's a child that got a divorce years before, embarrassed the family, and you've seen your grandchildren hurt by it, and you're still harboring anger toward that child. You've got to sit down and talk it through, because there's a solution for that. It's called confession and forgiveness and reconciliation. It's not best dealt with by changing a will or a trust to inflict some pain on somebody. So read is, again, something, if we can practice it in day-to-day life, it's like a sailor learning how to manage the wind. The good sailor can see the signs of the wind blowing, the clouds are coming, whitecaps are building, they anticipate some strong wind, they know how to adjust the sail, adjust the tiller to capture the power of the wind. When you're dealing with estate planning, there's a lot of emotions, a lot of power, and if you can capture the power of those emotions, it's like a sailor, you can win a race, you can get across the bay more quickly, but you've got to capture it in a constructive way, and you've got to know what that wind is doing to that.
Can I talk you more of probate or estate planning? Because a lot of times you don't know the dynamics of what's going on unless you've been with the family for a while. But I've got several probate, and they're all mad at me for being here. Yeah. Because they're killing each other right now.
It'll especially, in my experience, surface more at probate with the siblings. Now that they're experiencing the result of what the estate plan was, now they're in conflict with each other. But I've also found that working with the couple in estate planning, husband and wife can sometimes have some strong disagreement over these things, favoring one child over the other. But also, as they're working through this plan and they start to engage the siblings, and now they're trying to get their fingers into it, disagreeing, and that's not fair. So even in the estate planning process, the emotions can get very high.
The probate has provided me unbelievable opportunities for more business, because especially using this is a much more honed-in technique than I've used before. It's like, don't let this happen to you. Yeah. And so all of a sudden now I've got 5 plans I'm doing. When I was getting through the inexpensive probate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, they will certainly come out in a probate situation if conflict evolves. My passion right now is getting upstream of that. How do we actually create plans to begin with?
That's where how I see where this fits. Yeah. Because it's hard, because the mother always wants everything equal, and the dad says, no, that's not going to work, and then they're off the races.
That's right. Okay, one other acrostic, and this is one, again, I encourage families, modeled by mom and dad ideally, and the siblings pick it up and they're passing it on to their children. I would say if you're going to leave a legacy to your family, of all the legacies I'd rather pass on to my children, it's for them to, in every day of life, be God-aware, self-aware, other-aware. Because basically what those three principles are, those three broad categories, they are the fulfillment of the great commandment. Jesus was asked 2,000 years ago, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. So this is the best legacy you can pass on, I believe, to your children. It has more eternal value than any amount of money in your estate. But here's another aspect of how you can develop these relational skills in real life. And this is what we call the serve acrostic. And the metaphor we use in teaching the serve acrostic is an eagle. Eagles are seen flying up at 10 or 15,000 feet. They don't have the strength and the energy reserves to get that elevation on their own. What they do is they fly around until they sense a thermal, an updraft of warm air. It might be two weather fronts coming together, and that warm air is pushed up over the cold air. They spread their wings out, and they catch that updraft, and it lifts them up. And that's how I think God is calling us to be as we interact with other people. That everyone we interact with, from the first smile in the morning to our spouse, to a kind and encouraging word to a child at the breakfast table, to a family gathering at Thanksgiving, are you wind under the wings of your family? Are you wind under the wings of your paralegals and your partners? Are you wind under the wings of the clerk in the grocery store, or the barista in the coffee shop? And I'm not throwing that in there. I have found it's a lot of fun getting a cup of coffee, and part of what I'm doing is how can I put some lift under this barista's wings? How can I lift her? Because if I can practice it with her, guess what? I'm going to do it more naturally with my wife and my kids and my grandkids. So again, these are skills, practice them in daily life, and they become second nature. They become really Christ's image, his character built into us. So here's the 5 things in the serve acrostic, which you can do every single day, one of these things with every person you meet, and literally including the clerk in the grocery store, much less your family. So, first of all, just smile. It's amazing the power of a smile. People can recognize with 90% accuracy on the other end of a telephone line if you are smiling. Smiling changes the shape of the back of your throat, your soft palate, and your words come out smoother and softer. It's funny, you cannot pick it up consciously. If you have people listen to 2 sounds and they're listening consciously, you can't discern it. It is a subconscious process. I've got a friend who runs a business where he has lots of employees on the phone selling things. And in front of every employee's desk, there's a mirror, a little sign that says smile and die. Because he makes more money when his salesmen are smiling as they're talking to people. Now, if that's what happens just with your sound, just think of the effect as you look at people. You just smile at people and it has an effect. The neurological theory there is something we call mirror neurons. So when you smile at somebody, their brain, sort of that part of their brain that controls smiles, there's mirror neurons, supposedly sort of light up, and suddenly they're smiling. And if you try it, you'll find smiling is infectious. It may be the same reason, by the way, why one baby crying in the nursery, suddenly all 10 babies are crying. We connect with each other emotionally. So just smiling at somebody, and that could even be coming into a family meeting where you're going to talk about estate planning. You're sitting there with a solemn, defensive look on your face, you're setting a tone. If you smile warmly at your daughter-in-law, who you've had some tensions with in the past, you greet her warmly, you smile, it's good to see her, it sets a different tone. It can change the direction of that conversation. So there's a very powerful aspect of smiling. There's an extensive article I wrote on the 7 benefits of smiles. You can just go to it on our website. It's just our URL/smile. The second thing is to explore and to empathize, is to learn how to ask meaningful questions. There's a blog post I wrote that has 100 different questions you can ask in a conversation setting to draw out from people things that are meaningful and deep and touch on emotionally significant aspects of their life. Instead of just saying, so how long have you lived in Florida, and nice weather we're having, and all these superficial things we normally sort of get bogged down with, which, by the way, are also exhausting, because if you ask a question like that, you get a short answer, you get another question right away. But if you can ask questions that tap into people's emotions, significant events in their life, into hopes and dreams in their life, then you're getting into something where people are getting authentic with each other. So for example, one of the questions I use if I've just met some people and having dinner with them, I'll just say something like, if I'm dealing with some married couples, I'll say, well, when you all started dating, when you first met each other, what was the character quality you saw in the other person that made you think this could be the one? it's amazing the responses you get to a question like that. I mean, people think about it and say, well, my son is really respectful to his mother, or she picked up a kitten one time, was holding it, I thought, man, she'd make a great mother someday. I mean, you're talking about something more than just how many years you've lived someplace. It's an emotional thing. If you can ask questions that draw people and encourage people to say positive things about their spouse in a public setting, everybody likes that. It feels safe instead of making jokes and demeaning, and it's often the way we converse. So asking good questions and then empathizing. There's another extensive article on our website, again, our URL, rw360.org/empathy, and very detailed information about the neurological aspect of empathy. It's a capacity we all have. It's about age 2, we develop this capacity for empathy, and so you'll start seeing 2-year-olds manifesting sympathy, kindness, compassion toward other people. But it's like a teeny little flame on a campfire. You can either blow it out. Big boys don't cry. Big boys stuff their emotion. A real man is independent. We send all sorts of signals to young boys to stifle their empathetic capacity. And instead, we need to blow gently on it and help them develop the ability to read other people, their expression, their tone of voice, their facial expressions, and to draw that out. That's the compassionate, tender, gentle, kind husband or wife someday. So empathy is a very important quality. And when you do this, when you're developing empathy, you could have a family sitting. I remember one estate plan I was working on, and the family was there. There was obviously some tension going on, and mom and dad were saying certain things, and there was a young son and his wife over here. And man, there was so much information coming out, but it wasn't just what they were saying. It was their body language, it was how they moved, it was sighs and moans. And to be able to draw that out, to see what's going on, to ask questions. And sometimes what I'll do, it almost turned into like a mini mediation. I'd say, could I just talk to you two privately for just a few minutes? Just want to sort of check on some things. And mom and dad left, I talked to them. And there were some deep issues going on with them. And if I hadn't drawn those out and been able to communicate those to the parents, we would have been just fighting on this thing for endless time. So empathy is an incredibly powerful resource. Reconcile. For a Christian, this is a vital aspect. Estate planning often presents the opportunity, finally, after many years, to start moving towards some reconciliation in the family. Because it will surface issues. If you're sensitive to it, there's tensions, there's hurts, there's unmet expectations, there's a sense of unequal treatment that has maybe been floating around for many, many years. And so the family member, say a father who's initiating this estate planning process, can just realize, you know, my son Bob and I never did talk about this situation. Hamp put on a hunting trip, 15 years ago. We never really resolved these issues. Maybe he just goes out and has coffee with his son. Maybe he gets a pastor involved and say, I need you to help me talk something through with my son. Just my son. I need to work these issues through. Maybe in an estate planning process, there's some unresolved issues between 2 siblings. And the parents might be the key people to speak into their lives and finally bring a brother and a sister together and talk through issues that have separated them for years and really impeded their relationship. And then most of all, reconciliation. An estate planning process can surface so many difficult, painful, unresolved issues that people are just wrestling with and they don't see a solution to. And that may be the opportunity to share the gospel. And finally say, there is a solution. We can't undo the past. We can't take back those words. We can't undo that hurt. But we can take it to Christ and realize he took all of those sins, all those offenses to the cross, and he paid the price in full. It's an incredible opportunity to talk about the gospel, to share the gospel, which is really the most powerful peacemaking relational tool in our arsenal, is the gospel of Jesus Christ. So reconciliation is always something we should be thinking about in this process. Valuing the other person, affirming other people, expressing appreciation or admiration for their accomplishments. Sometimes there's children who just feel, I run into men all the time who just want their father's approval. They never felt like they could be quite good enough for dad. And they're driven for so many years trying to be successful and accomplished, just longing for a father to say, good job, son. And the previous generation, the older generation right now, many of them came out of a generation who just didn't express those things. You just, men were men, they're tough, we just do what we need to do, and that's what you are expected to do. And so to have this ability, and maybe it's many, many years too late, but better late than never, to express appreciation, to commend a child, or vice versa for children, to thank their parents for all that they did that they never said thank you for many years ago. The patience, the forgiveness. Maybe there was a child who had tremendous issues with drug abuse or other waywardness years ago, and the parents hung in with that child through all those years and forgave and reconciled, invested resources. Maybe that child never came and said, thank you, you saved my life. Estate planning process is where you get a lot of these things being surfaced. And then finally, to encourage. And that's just the idea. Encourage means to give courage, to inspire. And this is the whole idea of, at the end of a conversation, whether it's one on the phone, a estate planning conversation, a family meeting, a Thanksgiving feast, are people walking away encouraged with one another? Is there wind under their wings, so to speak, at the end of that process? And the great thing I found, because I'm a card-carrying introvert. I don't normally engage people voluntarily. That's what introverts, they just do their thing. But I am learning it is so much fun to engage people when your goal is really to encourage them, to value them, to lift them, and in many cases to build a relationship that opens a way eventually to sharing the gospel. There's some people we meet constantly, our teller at the bank, a clerk at the grocery store, people at stores we often go to. We have a chance to build a relationship over long periods of time that can open the door for sharing the gospel of Christ. And what I found, even if it's just a barista that I find a kind way to commend her artistic ability, putting the pattern on the foam on the top of the cup, is when I walk away and she's got this big smile on her face, I can tell there's some wind under her wings. The great thing is, there's wind under my wings. Because Proverbs 11:25 says that he who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. When we encourage other people, they themselves are, we ourselves walk away encouraged. So again, the reason I bring these things up in an estate planning workshop is if you are using these kinds of skills even before you get into the tough, down and dirty aspects of estate planning, as you build relationships in your family, as you bring healing in those relational hurts from the past, and then as you work through this process, you're talking to your children, you're talking to your advisors, you've got all the opportunities to be putting these things into practice. So I just encourage people to be weaving those 6 relational skills into day-to-day life so they become almost second nature. You don't have to think about it consciously, it just becomes who you are, self-aware, other-aware, God-aware. A few other principles that come to play I found very helpful in mediation in general. I think they apply very much to estate planning and probate cases. One of them is the idea of a passport. A passport is something that allows you to enter into a place you don't have an inherent right to be. And so when you have a passport into someone's life, that means you can get into their life. They will open up to you and share things with you they would normally not share. And that's a vital aspect of estate planning, of what families need to be doing is, can you create an atmosphere that people would answer yes to 3 basic questions. Can I trust you? Do you really care about me? Can you actually help me? So let's imagine a mother who, she and her husband are starting an estate planning process. She knows that over the years there's been some hurts among the siblings, and especially maybe her 2 daughters-in-law had a falling out at some family function years ago, and now they come, but they're guarded and they're not very close, and there's clearly a wall between them. Maybe the mother-in-law could be the agent of healing those things, because if those aren't healed, they will play out behind the scenes as those siblings and the children fight over these things. So the mother to sit down and seek to have a conversation with those daughters-in-law, one at a time, to go out, to have coffee, have a casual, lighthearted conversation first, but then eventually to see if you can get into this deeper issue in their lives. And you've got to be very gentle in how you do that. And as your daughter-in-law is sitting there listening to you and trying to decide, am I really going to open up to my mother-in-law and share why I'm so angry at my sister-in-law? And that daughter-in-law is going to say, can I trust you? Is she going to guard what I say? Will she respect what I say confidentially? Will she lose respect for me if I'm honest that I'm just, yeah, I'm bitter and that's just how I am? Can I really be honest and transparent with my mother-in-law? And she won't think less of me. She won't use this against me. That she won't judge me. That she'll be understanding. Is she here because she really cares about me? Is there a pattern over the years of her loving and caring and being there for me and helping me in things? And then, can she really help me? Do I see in her life the kind of wisdom, the relational wisdom in her relationships? Have I seen her forgive other people? Have I seen her confess when she's been wrong, of humbling herself? Have I seen those things that she can deal with relationships? Yes, she's someone whose example can inspire me. So those are all the kinds of things that we can build in any relationship over time. Many interactions is we're doing things that tell people they can trust us, that we really care about them, and that we can actually help them. They will come to us. Another concept that I find is very, very helpful in estate planning is something we call the 3 Ps of satisfaction. And I learned this in my mediation work, that when people ask me to sit down with them and resolve a conflict, they usually had a substantive issue in mind. There was a contract they wanted to have enforced. There was some issue that was important to them that they wanted to get taken care of. And that's what we would call the presenting issue, the substantive issue. In a church conflict, it might be, do we hire a new youth pastor? Do we launch a building program? All sorts of things that come up, and there's an issue people are talking about. But there's not just that issue that's playing a role in this situation. There's also a process that is significant in how we engage each other. And in mediation, what I found is that I needed to provide the parties with a clear and fair process. There were no surprises. People had plenty of time to gather information, to communicate their concerns, that they knew what was coming next, that at the end of our conversation, or many conversations over the course of time, they would say, this is a really good, clear, fair process. I wasn't surprised, I wasn't caught off guard, I was never at a disadvantage. Thank you for providing this safe process. The third kind of satisfaction, or the second one, is personal satisfaction. And that's that we treat people equally, respectfully. Our body language, our tone of voice, how we're communicating them. And it really has to come from the heart, because people sense. If you've got one party and you just think he's an idiot, you can be as nice as you think you can be, but it'll still come across. Your contempt, your disrespect will still be communicated. So really looking at somebody who might be doing some really foolish things and still be praying, say, Lord, this poor guy doesn't even know what he's doing. He's trapped in this thing. Give me compassion for him. Allow me to serve him, to help him. That this whole process would be a blessing to him. So praying for God to give you grace, and that would be communicated to this person in everything you say and do. Personal respect, personal courtesy, no favoritism. And then the third thing is this product satisfaction, the actual outcome, the decision that is reached. What is the estate plan? How is property distributed, etc. Here's the key. What I found in a mediation process is that you're often limited on what you can do with the final outcome. You might have a contract that you have to honor. There might be laws you have to honor. There may be some limitations. You can't just say, well, I know the contract said this, but we're just going to do this. We're constrained sometimes by facts and legal commitments and obligations. So you can't always give people the result they want, but you can always give people all of the process and all of the personal satisfaction in the world. And what I found is in cases where people were unhappy with the final substantive decision, how we decided something, whether a mediation or arbitration, if they felt they had really good process satisfaction, if they were treated courteously, they would usually walk away satisfied. And I've seen this again and again and again. One case, an attorney lost a $2 million contingency fee in an arbitration, and she was not even a Christian. I thought for sure she would be unhappy with the whole conciliation process, and she wrote a glowing endorsement of Christian conciliation. And when I called her to talk about it, I was surprised. I said, you did lose? And she said, yeah, I've been around long enough. You win a few, you lose a few, but I love your process. I like the fact that the arbitrators prayed at the beginning of all the meetings. She wasn't even a Christian. She said, just set a tone. It was a reasonable, good faith conversation. They gave us lots of time for discovery. They granted the continuances I needed. They all knew what the subject matter was. I could not have expected more from anybody. In fact, she said, it's funny you would call today. I just got off the phone with another attorney recommending she bring a similar case to you. So here's someone who lost a $2 million contingency fee who still recommended the process. Now the same thing applies to estate planning. The heirs, the devotees, will not always get what they want. They will not always get, control of the company or whatever it might be. But if they really feel like they had an opportunity to express their concerns, if they were listened to, if they were treated with courtesy, you have a much higher likelihood of them accepting the result and not taking it out relationally on their brothers and sisters over the next 20 years. So just a very important thing, anytime that you're doing that, and I would have to say, that's not just mediation. That applies in a family as well. The family relationships have to have this as well. Just a humorous but true example is when our children were young, my wife Corlette homeschooled our children. And I call homeschooling accelerated sanctification for mothers. When you're with those little sinners 24/7, you bring out everything. And so there were days I would come home at the end of the day and Corlette was really at her limit. One or both of our kids had been challenging that day. And Corlette, I'd walk in and say, how was your day? So, oh, let me tell you. She'd tell me and want me to immediately go and bring some kind of discipline on one of the kids. I said, well, I'll go and talk to him. And she would say, you don't need to talk to him. I told you what just happened. You need to go in and actually give some discipline so he learns from this. I said, Corlette, I've got to hear his side of the story. Why do you need to hear his side of the story? I told you what's going on. Don't you believe me? I'm your wife. I said, I do believe. I do believe. But if I don't let him give his side and make a defense, he will feel there's been a gross injustice done. I'm quite confident when I get all the facts, what you said will be true and accurate, but I need to give him the satisfaction of sharing his perspective, giving us these things. And Corlette, she would realize, yeah, you're right, you need to do that. So even children have this sense of being entitled to a fair process. Due process is the term we use in law. Same thing in estate planning. So let's talk about now finally just a few of the peacemaking principles that come to bear when you are dealing with conflict. And this again will sometimes come up. Estate planning process will surface conflicts within a family. And you as the family leader or a participant in the process will need to be helping them. First thing I always tell people when I start working with them in conflict resolution is to see conflict as an opportunity. And the Apostle Paul brings this out in many, many places in his writing. It's actually all over the Bible, but one verse in particular, when Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, it's basically a conflict resolution letter. From beginning to end, he's dealing with all sorts of conflicts, doctrinal issues, leadership issues, theological issues, and one of them is a dietary issue. What can you eat, what can you drink? And that's in chapter 9 and 10. And at the end of chapter 10, Paul says this. It's sort of like he summarizes everything he's been talking about for 10 chapters. He says, therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Whether your conflicts over dietary concerns or who can take communion, do it all for the glory of God. Do not seek your own good, but the good of many. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And he's basically describing three opportunities in conflict: to bring glory to God, to draw attention to the excellence of his character and his ways, to minister to and serve other people, and to grow to be like Christ. And so when you've got an estate planning process and there's conflict, the tendency is just try to jump in and resolve the substantive issue and not realize, hold on, we've got an opportunity to help this entire family be reminded of God's goodness, God's grace, God's forgiveness. We have an opportunity for each one of us to serve the other person, to be sensitive to the other person's needs and desires. Is there healing that needs to take place? Are there confessions that need to take place? Forgiveness that needs to take place? And then to grow to be like Christ is this a place where God's calling me to die to some of the lusts and cravings that control me? Materialism and acquiring things and getting my way and pride. Is this where God wants to prune me? So I always try to help people right from the beginning and start thinking of those opportunities. How do I glorify God? How do I serve other people? How do I grow to be like Christ? As people come to grips with those those goals, one of the things that I always talk about is Philippians 4, 1 and 2. And this is a key verse for conflict resolution. It says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from desires that battle within you? You want something but don't get it. You kill and covet, you quarrel and fight. If that doesn't describe a probate process, I don't know what does. And the issue there, he says, what causes these things? He says they're desires that battle within you. And what's interesting is the word that Paul uses there is not the word desire that would be an inherently sinful lust or craving. It's a neutral term. And it means that there can be desires that can be legitimate desires initially, but they can start consuming us. And what I describe it as is...
you ought to talk, you didn't tell me to say this, but I passed that book out. That's a great book. It's the best book in process. It was great for family, but it's phenomenal for businesses that claim or hold themselves out to be Christian.
Thank you.
And thank you, because there really is no other book like it, because it is for the lawyer mind and the business owner mind. It's logical, it follows a flow and a rhythm that people can understand and internalize and use in their business and their families. It's helped me on both sides.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Most people who read the Peacemaker book say that the chapter on idolatry is the most significant chapter. Because when you get to the heart of it, what is the desire that has grown into a demand? You know, my desire is to have my father approve of me. And my demand is he's going to do it by make me president of the company. If I can't be president of the company after he dies, then man, it's war. And so that demand then comes up. We start to judge anyone who stands between us, judging our deceased parents, judging our brothers and sisters, and then we find a way to punish. And it can be over little things or huge things. So a big part of conflict resolution is helping people understand what is the desire that may seem good at first, but has become so controlling that it is now consuming me. It's ruling my life. Once people realize what those desires are, start coming to grips with them and how they've affected relationships, then there's often a time for confession. And I've used a lot of these situations, both estate planning and probate, as opportunities for people to come clean, to confess things that might have happened 20, 30 years ago, and say, I can still remember the day that X, Y, and Z, and I know now, I realize, I've known all these years that must have hurt you deeply. And to walk through a process we call the 7 A's of confession, to address everyone involved. Maybe it's just your brother, maybe it's just a parent, or maybe the whole family's been affected. Maybe grandchildren have been sucked into the vortex of this conflict, and maybe you need to have an uncle stand up to a whole family and talk about 20 people that his act 15 years ago affected all of them. That takes courage, that takes humility, that takes grace, but it's a tremendous way. Think about some cases I've been in where it brings glory to God. People are saying, there must be a God to see Uncle Bob get up and do what he just did. So to address everyone involved, to avoid the excuses, if, buts, and maybes, to admit specifically the pride, the idolatry, the greed, the bitterness, whatever it was in the heart that was driving these things, to acknowledge how someone's behavior affected other people, impacted them, to accept the consequences of it, to realize, I know it hurt you this way, and this is what I want to do to try to bring some healing, some restitution here. To commit to change, altering our changes. God, please help me to deal with this pride, this desire to always be the one who's in the right, to get what I want. To then go on and asking for forgiveness, to bring healing in that family situation. And a confession then leads the way to forgiveness. And our forgiveness should model the forgiveness we have in Christ through the gospel. And I describe it in these terms, that forgiveness is essentially making 4 promises that reflect the promises God makes to us through the gospel. I will not dwell on this incident any longer. And the Bible says God promises, as far as the east is from the west, so far have I separated your sins from you, I will remember your sins no more. Secondly, I will not bring this incident up and use it against you in the future. Third, I will not talk to other people about this incident. It's done. It's gone. And I will not allow this incident to stand between us or hinder our personal relationship. I can tell you this, that even if an estate or probate process is dealing with millions of dollars of assets, that pales in comparison in the eyes of God to people authentically repenting, confessing, and forgiving each other. Because all the money in the bank account, all the stock, the company, the assets, all that will someday be dust. But when we live out the gospel toward other people, when we show Christ's character working in us, his sanctifying, redeeming grace, that echoes for eternity. And so having this kind of confession, this kind of forgiveness is huge. Another skill that's very helpful in these estate planning issues is what we call the pause principle of negotiation. And this is where you're trying to help people deal, if you can deal with first the relational issues through confession and forgiveness, the offenses, the hurts, the disappointments that took place through that peacemaking process, but then you still have an issue. Who's going to run the company? Who's going to stay and manage the ranch? How are we going to appropriate the property in a way that we don't have to sell the ranch, but the other siblings get some value from it? What can we do there? There's major substantive issues that come out. And so that's where we walk them through a negotiation process, hopefully now not being driven by these underground emotions and things that were in the past, but they've been resolved. And now they're dealing in good faith with a loving heart, a generous spirit toward the members of the family. And so preparing, get the facts, get the data together, not only the legal technical issues, but the deeds and the value of the property, its true worth, and the cash flow, and who really wants to be here managing it, and what's going to benefit the community for this ranch to stay a going concern, the families that are working there. There's lots of information you can gather and get all that data in front of you. That's wisdom. Gather relevant information. Affirm relationships. Listen to one another. Ask questions. Affirm one another. Appreciate what the other person has done in this process to bring you to this point, the positive things. Understand interests. This is the key step in it. And we use a diagram of an iceberg to illustrate this pause principle. Most of an iceberg, 80 to 90% of an iceberg, is underwater. That just has to do with the mass of ice compared to liquid water. And in many conflicts, the real issues driving the conflict are not evident immediately. They're sort of underground. Now, people may know what's really driving them and they just won't be honest about it at first, or they may not even realize how much they're being driven by some of these desires. And so to try to understand what is really going on here. For example, if one son in an estate planning or probate situation is really driving for some kind of portion of the estate or control of the estate, and that's the driving issue, if you can get down to the personal issue, that maybe what he's looking for is for his dad to say, I think you would do a good job running this company. He just wants the affirmation from his father. If that's the real issue going on, the real interest is relational instead of having this asset. Man, that's a very important thing to bring out and surface. And then finally, when you come up with some of these interests, you understand what this person's interest and that person, they don't always automatically dovetail. And then you have to say, okay, what's some creative brainstorming? And I think Christians should be the best brainstormers in the world because we can draw the Holy Spirit in and say, Lord, give us some insights to come up with a creative solution here we would not come up with on our own. And one of the things I've always loved about Christian conciliation is when you're not constrained by just a courtroom atmosphere and adversarialness and advocacy, but really looking for the best result, and everybody is thinking and praying and brainstorming, we've come up with solutions to things that you would never get in a court of law. My father was a trial judge, and he was not a Christian when I began the ministry, Peacemaker Ministries, but over the years he started seeing these resolutions come about that he knew were not normal. He initially told me that when I was going to do a mediation, he'd say, well, son, I appreciate your attitude and what you're trying to do here, but I've seen 100 cases like that, and I don't sell, you're wasting your time. And I'd come home that night and he'd ask what happened. I said, wow, it's pretty amazing. And he said, well, that is surprising. There's a few flukes now and then. And he started noticing a lot of flukes. And I'll never forget the night I came home at midnight from a long mediation, and my dad was waiting up for me. And he said, what happened? What happened? He was tasting the divine.
Oh, that's great.
He was tasting the divine. My father came to Christ shortly before he died because he saw the power of Christ working in situations that he knew were impossible to reconcile in human effort. So when we search for those creative solutions, ask the Holy Spirit to guide us. The best solutions, the ones that still just blow me away, is where a brother and a sister fighting over assets, each like a tug of war. And once they work through this process of dealing with the heart and the offenses and what's really going on, we're sitting in a room And now we've got a whole new conflict. The brother is saying, no, you should get this. And they say, no, I want you to have that. Mom would want it to have. And I love it because there's two attorneys sitting there and they're going, what is going on here? I mean, it is a supernatural event to see the Holy Spirit come into a situation like that. I love when non-Christian attorneys see that kind of redeeming power from Christ. And that's what we can do in these situations. And then finally evaluate those options objectively to come up with, what are some ways we could test this out? What are some ways we could pilot test this or think this through or get some independent evaluations coming into this thing? It can be a fun process. One attorney told me, it was an estate, it was a probate situation, and it had been litigated for about a year. They'd spent more money on litigation than the assets were worth already. It was so classic. And we finally got the parties into mediation, both professing to be Christians. And it's like a day-and-a-half mediation. And it just ended with an incredible reconciliation, one of the parties being incredibly generous in how he dealt with the other person, much more so than that person could have demanded. And after the mediation was over, the attorney for the very generous party lingered in my office and everyone else left. And I thought for sure he was going to chew me out, that his client had given away too much, it was unfair and everything else. And he closed the door. He said, what happened here today?
It's the Holy Spirit.
He said, yeah. He said, I've never seen this before. He said, Ken, this is the most fun I've had as an attorney in 10 years. I feel like we're really working together to come up with a solution that benefited every person in the room. And he went on to be trained as a conciliator. It was a tremendous illustration of the power of peacemaking. So finally, I want to just wrap up. In the outline, there's just a few practical things that can help you to prepare for these issues in addition to these relational skills. I hope you're hearing me. The most important thing is develop these relational skills, practice these relational skills. But there's some very practical things you can do also. And I just want to talk about how you can address some primary issues. Is number one, really define what is your life vision. Do you have a mission statement? What do you want to accomplish? Is it just build a big company and a big bank account? That's not going to account for anything in eternity. What is the greatest thing you want to pass on to your children? What legacy do you want to pass on? A lot of wealth? Or do you want to pass on a fully united family, a strong testimony for Christ? When my father predeceased my mother, and when my mother died and we were doing the distribution of the estate, with my brother and my sister, there wasn't the slightest tug of war. We were each saying to the other person, like, I know you've always liked this, so this would be good for you to have this. We were blessing one another, and I just said, if Mom and Dad can look down from heaven right now and see what's going on, they are smiling. We're fulfilling what they would have desired. So to pass that on, a strong testament of God's grace, seeing ourselves as stewards of these resources being passed to the next generation for the kingdom work. What principles and values can we pass on? Even teaching these relational concepts, passing on the peacemaking principles and the peacemaker to our children. Who do we look to for advice or counsel or wisdom? Is it just a very technically competent estate planning attorney or accountant? Or do we go to our pastor? Do we go to our elders? Do we go to godly people we know, getting their wisdom, which I think is more valuable in the long run. Spiritual, godly wisdom is an incredible value. Another thing to do is to try to anticipate and address some of these issues beforehand. The issue of stepchildren, for example. The issues with one child, a grandchild has some destructive lifestyle issues. How can you set up a trust where you're still giving resources to that person's care, but not putting them in a position where they can just take that and squander it to their harm? Talking about parties private, or with each of the key parties privately. Sitting down with a daughter, sitting down with a son, having a conversation, husband and wife. I've sent some couples to their pastor. They say, your issue right now is not estate planning. Your issue is there's unresolved issues in your marriage, and an attorney is not going to be able to help you with that. Your pastor is the one you should be talking to, or a good counselor. Get those issues resolved there. It's a little bit like in divorce cases. When people go through a messy divorce and there's unresolved issues in their relationship, the people who pay for that typically are the children. because they communicate that animosity through children in the custody, the visitation, the child support. They don't even mean to do it, but it's going, that acid of unresolved issues is going through the children. Same thing can
Front of
happen.
the court calls it modeling.
Yeah, right.
You model the parents'
That's right.
animosity.
Practicing other awareness in all, oh no, one thing is that just when you recognize there's relational issues, put the technical process on hold, deal with the relational issues with pastoral counseling or Christian counseling, and then come back and deal with the technical, legal, estate planning issues. Review all the language in the trust documents and the wills with other awareness. How is this person going to hear that? How is that person going to read this? How is it going to come across to that person? Put yourself in that person's shoes. And pray for the Holy Spirit to help you see things you wouldn't normally see. A lot of us are not good at putting ourselves in the other person's position. We just see everything as we think is reasonable. Dealing with cherished personal property in a separate list is just usually a good idea. Updating estate plan regularly. Don't just do one and then sit on it for 25 years. Facilitating open conversations about things. It's often, if you're a conflict avoider, you're not going to want to talk about the family vacation home or the cabin or whatever, and I hope it'll just work itself out. You're doing your family a huge disservice if you don't talk these things through. And then just recognizing and commending the long-term contributions that some family members have made. Let me give an example. Years ago, I was dealing with a family in dispute, in a very messy conflict. 3 siblings. One of the sons had some disability issues, some mental disability issues, lived with the mother for many, many years. He was fairly self-reliant, but he still lived with his mother, partly to care for her, and partly because she sort of cared for him. And when Mom died, the estate plan was that the children would all have equal ownership of this farm, including quite a bit of land, and which had been leased out for quite a while, and the farmhouse where the mother and the one son lived. When Mom died, the other 2 siblings, especially one of the older brother, just wanted to sell this, get the money out of it. He had some other things, some investments and stuff he wanted to do. He just wanted to push the whole thing through to a sale. Well, this one brother had been living there all this time. He just lost his mother. He'd lived with his entire life. He's like 50 years old. And he's already traumatically affected by that. The idea of moving out of that house, selling it and moving out, was the most frightening thing in the world. The sister was trying to act as the peacemaker between the 2 brothers, and the one brother living there had a gun. And he finally said, if anyone comes here and tries to move me out, I'll shoot him. So it was a really serious situation. As we talked with the family when we first met, I got the pastors involved. They were going to 2 different churches. I got the pastors involved, sitting down, dealing with hard issues, dealing with spiritual issues, everything else. And again, it's that God awareness component, relational wisdom. When we started getting people thinking again about the gospel, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. I mean, he gave up everything for us. And the Holy Spirit began to convict this one older brother, especially, of his selfishness and his pride and control. He was a very domineering man. And the Lord just began to soften his heart. And they finally came up with an idea to set up basically a life estate in the home and a portion. We're going to sell the land, the farmland, but leave a life estate for the brother so he could stay in the home as long as he wanted. And then eventually, when he passed away, they could distribute those assets. But more important than that, they decided they wanted to tell him that in a special family gathering. And so they had the whole family, which is probably about 20 people with the nephews and nieces involved. They had a family gathering. The sister had to work really hard to get the brother in the farmhouse to come to this thing because he was so afraid of leaving and there's some trick going on, but she finally persuaded him to come. And during that family gathering, the brother and the sister had gotten somebody to make a beautiful plaque for the brother who lived with the mother all the years, commending him
That's nice.
for his loving care for their mother. And all the years that he had been there for her, loving her, caring for, honoring her. And they presented this at this family dinner. And One of the nephews leaned over to his cousin and said, "There must be a God for Uncle Bob to do that." This is the story I keep thinking of, where these nephews and nieces had seen their uncle do something they knew was not his nature. It healed the family. It gave a testimony to the glory of God. It was a very powerful restorative process. So let me just say one last thing to help you develop these skills. There's 5 resources I want to commend to you to weave into your lives today. One of them is there's an online course where we have interactive online training, teaching videos, demonstration videos that can weave these things into your life. And again, if you learn these skills and practice them in your marriage, with your kids, with your coworkers, with the people in your life, then when you're doing this in an estate planning or a probate process, they're just, again, part of your second nature. We also just released an app, a smartphone app. It's available at Google and the iPhone store. It's got hundreds of articles, videos, all of these acrostics are on it. And it's also developed in both what we call a faith-based and a values-based format. So you can use it actually to share these principles with a non-Christian. We got a version you can talk with a non-Christian about it. It doesn't have the Bible verses. Instead of being God aware, God engaging, it's values aware, values engaging. So it's really a witnessing tool you can use to talk to other people about it. There's a blog, a weekly blog that comes out with concepts of relational wisdom every week, just to remind people of these things. A lot of ministries use these things for devotional, staff devotionals. And then the book, The Peacemaker, we referred to here during the seminar. And then finally, there's a booklet, it's a free download on our website called Guiding People Through Conflict. And it lays out the whole conciliation process, all the way from conflict coaching. How do you get somebody just to give you advice on how to resolve some of these issues within a family context or a business context? Mediation, how do you get someone to bring 2 parties together? Maybe a brother and a sister who need to have someone help them work through these issues. All the way up to arbitration, you can submit issues there. And I've had some estate and probate issues with a family fight. I said, we're tired of fighting. We just don't want to fight anymore. These are some godly people we respect. Let us just sort of present the information to them. Whatever they come up with, we're going to accept that to settle this thing, because having our family together is more important than just years and years of litigation. So all those processes are available to you. So there's a lot more information on our website, rw360.org, and we have a whole network of trained, certified relational conciliators that are here to serve people, and we're happy to do that if we can give any service to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.